Ahoy, and welcome aboard. I'm the captain of this channel, Captain Sleepy. Tonight we step ashore in Port Royal, Tortuga, and Nassau. The rough and tumble port towns full of wooden taverns, where hardy old sea dogs clinked tankards of ale beneath low, smoke-darkened beams, wagered hard-earned plunder, whispered tales of hidden treasure and ill-gotten booty, and let the rum soften the edges of another long voyage. Relax as Edmund Fairchild narrates Chapter 4, The Taverns of the Pirates. Sleep well, matey.
The Taverns of the Pirates, Part 1. The Harbour at Dusk. Imagine you are arriving by sea. The sun is going down somewhere behind the island, and the last of its light is catching the water of the harbour in long orange streaks. The ship you are on has been at sea for weeks. You have eaten salt pork and hardtack, and drunk water that tasted of the barrel it was stored in. And you are tired in the particular way that the sea makes you tired. Not just in your body, but in some deeper part of you that has spent too long watching the horizon and finding nothing there but more horizon. And then the harbour opens up, and the town appears, and everything changes. This is Port Royal, Jamaica, in the year 1668. The town sits on a narrow spit of land that curves out from the south coast of the island like a finger pointing into the Caribbean. It is not a large place in terms of land. The entire settlement occupies about 52 acres, which is roughly the size of a modest farm. But those 52 acres are packed with something close to 2,000 buildings, 6,000 people, and more taverns per square mile than anywhere else on the face of the earth. At the height of its fame, Port Royal has one drinking establishment for every 10 residents. You are never more than a short walk from a cup of rum. The smell that reaches you first, carried on the trade wind from the east, is wood smoke and salt water, and something sweet and fermented underneath it all. Molasses and raw rum from the distilleries that have been operating on this island since the English took it from the Spanish in 1655. Then the sound. The harbour is busy at all hours, but in the evening it is busiest of all. The captains calling to their crews, the longboats pulling back and forth between the anchored ships and the wooden docks, the sound of music from somewhere in the town drifting across the water, a fiddle and something percussive. The beginning of an evening that shows no particular signs of ending at any reasonable hour. In 1688 alone, 213 ships visited this port. Let that number settle for a moment. 213 ships in a single year in a harbour bounded by a strip of sand barely half a mile wide, coming and going with the cargoes of a colonial Caribbean economy that was growing faster than anyone had expected, and in directions that the people who had founded the colony had not entirely anticipated. The longboat reaches the dock, and you climb the weathered wooden steps, and Port Royal receives you. It receives you with noise first. The harbour district is the loudest part of any working port, and Port Royal's is louder than most. The business of loading and unloading cargo, the arguments between sailors about who owes what to whom, the cries of the vendors who have set themselves up on the dock itself to catch arriving sailors before they have had a chance to spend their money elsewhere. Then the smell of the town itself, which is the smell of a place where a great many people live in close proximity without an adequate system of waste disposal. Salt and wood smoke and refuse and the sweetness of the rum that underlies everything in the colonial Caribbean, the way that garlic underlies everything in a Mediterranean kitchen. And then, as you move from the dock into the streets of the town, something else. A quality of energy, of purposeful disorder, of a place that has organized itself around certain specific priorities and has let everything else look after itself. Port Royal is not a beautiful town. It is a useful one, and the two things in the 17th century Caribbean were not the same. This is what the Golden Age of Piracy actually looked like from the inside, not the version from the stories, the dramatic sea battles and the walking of planks and the buried treasure marked with an X. The reality was more mundane and more interesting than that. The reality was this: a small, crowded, astonishingly wealthy town on the end of a sand spit in the Caribbean, where the money flowed as freely as the rum, and where the men who had made their fortunes on the Spanish Main came ashore to spend them, and where the town had organized itself entirely around the needs of those men. The result was one of the most extraordinary places the 17th century produced, and we are going to spend the night in it. Part 2. The wickedest city on earth. Port Royal earned its nickname honestly. The Reverend John Taylor, who visited in the 1680s and approached the experience from the particular vantage point of a man of God, confronted with something that challenged every assumption he had brought with him from England, called it the most wicked and sinful city in the world. His contemporary, another visiting minister, called it one of the lewdest places in the Christian world, a sink of all filthiness, a mere Sodom. They were not entirely wrong, though they were perhaps missing something about why it had become what it was. The town's fortunes were built on privateering, the semi-official form of piracy in which individual ship captains were granted letters of marque by the English crown, authorizing them to attack the ships and settlements of England's enemies, principally Spain, and to keep a portion of whatever they took. The distinction between a privateer and a pirate was, in practice, a matter of paperwork and political context. Henry Morgan, who raided Panama City in 1671 in one of the most audacious military operations the Caribbean had ever seen, taking a city of 30,000 people with roughly 1,200 men after a 9-day march through the jungle, was a privateer with a commission. He returned to Port Royal with enough silver and gold to make him the most celebrated man in Jamaica, was briefly imprisoned in England when it turned out he had made war after a peace treaty had been signed without anyone bothering to tell him, and was eventually sent back to Jamaica as its lieutenant governor, which was the English crown's way of handling a man who was too famous and too dangerous to punish and too useful to waste. The wealth that Morgan and the men like him brought back to Port Royal was real, and it was substantial. Contemporary accounts describe pieces of 8, Spanish silver coins, the reserve currency of the Atlantic world, flowing so freely through the town's taverns and gaming houses that normal barter was largely abandoned in favor of hard currency. Charles Leslie, writing about Port Royal in the 1660s, described buccaneers who had been known to spend 2,000 to 3,000 pieces of 8 in a single night. He noted one who paid 500 pieces of 8 simply to see a woman dance for him unclothed. They had been known, he wrote, to buy an entire pipe of wine, roughly 500 litres of it, and place it in the street, obliging everyone who passed to drink from it. This was not generosity exactly. It was the performance of wealth by men who had a great deal of it and very little sense of what to do with it beyond spending it. The 40 tavern licenses granted in the single month of July 1661 give you some sense of the pace at which the town was growing its hospitality sector. 1 license per day, roughly, for an entire month, in a settlement that already had a substantial number of drinking establishments before that particular month began. By the peak of Port Royal's prosperity in the late 1680s, the town had 44 tavern keepers among its recorded population, along with 4 goldsmiths, an assortment of merchants, artisans and shipwrights, a significant number of enslaved people who constituted roughly a third of the population, and a proportion of the population described in the colonial records with a specificity that the census takers clearly considered important, simply as prostitutes. The taverns were not all alike. There were 2 distinct types of drinking establishment in the English colonial Caribbean, and the distinction mattered. The public house was quite literally a private home opened to passing trade. Any household with a surplus of home-brewed ale might hang out a sign and receive customers, no questions asked, which was particularly suitable for men who preferred not to attract the attention of anyone who might be taking notes on their comings and goings. The tavern was a purpose-built commercial establishment, a sitting room, a bar of some kind, a dancing area in the better ones, stabling for those arriving on horseback from the interior of the island, and typically at least a few upstairs rooms available to those who needed somewhere to sleep and either could not or would not face the journey back to their ship. Some of the larger taverns were genuine buildings of 2 and 3 stories, their ground floors given over entirely to the public trade, their upper floors divided into the rooms that passing sailors and arriving buccaneers needed. The walls of these establishments were covered in notices, sale advertisements for recently acquired cargo, the nature of which was not inquired into too closely by any party who wished to do future business. Reward posters for escaped enslaved people, which were the routine administrative wallpaper of the colonial Caribbean. Announcements of trials and scheduled hangings. Port Royal had courts when it had the will to use them. And above all, information. The currency of the tavern that was more valuable in many respects than any other. Which ships had been seen in which waters, which captains were looking for crew, which merchants would ask no questions about the provenance of a cargo, which governor was currently inclined to be cooperative and which was not, and what had changed his disposition from one to the other. The tavern was the intelligence exchange of the pirate economy, and the man who sat in the corner with his rum punch and his ears open was conducting business as surely as any merchant on the Royal Exchange in London, 6,000 miles away. Part 3. What they drank. The drink of Port Royal was rum, not the refined and aged product that later centuries would learn to appreciate. This was kill devil, the name by which Jamaican rum was first known, a name that required no elaboration for anyone who had tried it. It was raw and fierce, and it smelled strongly of the sugar cane from which it was distilled, a byproduct of the sugar industry that had found its most enthusiastic market among precisely the people who had the least reason to be careful about what they consumed. A resident of Port Royal in 1664 wrote to a friend in England with the following assessment: "Rum punch is not improperly called kill devil, for thousands lose their lives by its means. When newcomers use it to the least excess, they expose themselves to imminent peril, for it heats the blood and brings on fevers, which in a very few hours send them to their graves." This was a genuine health warning, and not merely the rhetoric of a temperance advocate. The combination of raw rum, the Caribbean heat, the physical exertion of life at sea, and the various tropical diseases to which newly arrived Europeans had no immunity was, in fact, frequently fatal. Yellow fever and malaria were endemic. The rum did not cause these diseases, but a body weakened by heavy drinking and poor nutrition was a body with reduced capacity to fight them, and the fevers that carried off so many Port Royal residents in their first months on the island were real fevers, with real microbiological causes that the 17th century understood only in the broadest terms. And yet the rum was drunk in quantities that continually astonished visitors from elsewhere, because the alternative was water, and the water was not reliable. The fresh water available in Port Royal came from wells sunk into the sandy soil of the spit, and its quality was variable at best and actively dangerous at worst, contaminated by the density of the population living around the wells and the primitive state of the settlement's sanitation. Rum, raw, fierce, dangerous, was at least predictably itself. It killed what it touched, including some of the things that would otherwise have killed the person drinking it. The drink that most people in the taverns were actually consuming was not raw rum, but punch. Punch was the great social drink of the 17th century Atlantic world, consumed in taverns and in the houses of the wealthy, and on the decks of ships at sea, mixed in enormous earthenware bowls and shared among everyone at the table in a ritual of collective drinking that served simultaneously as hospitality, as social bonding, and as an extremely effective way of consuming a large amount of rum while maintaining the impression of moderation. The basic Port Royal version was called bumbo or bamboo, rum, water, sugar, and nutmeg mixed to taste, which in the Caribbean in the 17th century meant mixed to be very strong, moderately sweet, and warmly spiced. For those who wanted something more elaborate, the taverns could produce rum fustian, a mixture of raw eggs, sugar, sherry, gin, and ale that contained, confusingly, no rum at all despite its name, and that sounds to modern ears like something you might make when desperate rather than something you might order by choice. There was flip, made of ale and brandy with egg and sugar, served warm, which was a cold-weather drink that the Caribbean's heat made theoretically unnecessary, but that was ordered anyway. There was sangaree, wine mixed with fruit and sugar, the ancestor of sangria. And for the truly committed, there was something called hangman's blood, which was exactly what it sounds like. A mixture of every strong spirit available, combined without particular care for compatibility, consumed in the knowledge that the name was a fair description of its effects. The food served in the pirate taverns had a signature dish that deserves its own moment. Salmagundi, sometimes written Salamagundi, was the great pirate meal, served in Port Royal and Nassau and Tortuga, and every port where buccaneers gathered, and it was, in its honest description, a kind of magnificent chaos. The cook took whatever was to hand: turtle meat, which was abundant in the Caribbean, and which the buccaneers of the early period had hunted alongside their cattle and pigs; fish, roasted or boiled; pork, chicken, duck, pigeon. Any meat available was roasted and then chopped into chunks and marinated in spiced wine with garlic and herbs, then combined generously, without concern for convention, with hard-boiled eggs, pickled onions, cabbage, anchovies, pickled herring, mangoes, palm hearts, olives, and grapes, seasoned heavily with salt, pepper, mustard seed, oil, and vinegar, served in a heap on a large plate, or simply in the bowl it had been assembled in, with rum punch alongside. It sounds, written down, like the result of a pantry being emptied without a plan, in the hands of a tavern cook who had been making it for years from the contents of whatever vessel had most recently been relieved of its cargo. It was probably excellent. The marinade did real work. The combination of preserved and fresh ingredients, salty and acidic and sweet, was the logic of a cuisine built around what kept at sea and what was available when you made port. Part 4. The Night in the Tavern. The evening in a Port Royal tavern did not follow the patterns of an English inn. An English inn had a closing time, or something approaching one. It had a landlord who was at some point going to suggest that the hour was late and the guests might consider their beds. It had neighbors with opinions about noise after midnight, and a system of social norms that, however imperfectly observed, at least acknowledged that the night had a shape, and that the shape included an ending. Port Royal's taverns did not especially recognize any of this. The night in a Port Royal tavern was simply the day continuing, with the advantage of darkness and the disadvantage of darkness in roughly equal measure. The fiddle that had been playing since before sunset was still playing. The same fiddle player, slightly less coordinated than he had been at the start of the evening, working through the same repertoire of English jigs and sea shanties, and the occasional piece of something that had been picked up in a Spanish port, and was neither English nor Spanish anymore, but something that belonged to the Caribbean itself. The dice had been rolling on the same table since afternoon. The bowls of punch had been replenished many times. New arrivals had replaced those who had fallen asleep in their chairs, or been carried up to the upstairs rooms, or simply wandered back to their ships. And the energy of the place had the self-sustaining quality of something that had forgotten how to stop. The dice games were the heartbeat of the tavern's night economy. Dice gambling, alia, was not exactly legal in Port Royal in the sense that it was not exactly illegal occupying the same ambiguous territory as most of the town's activities, something that everyone did, that the authorities periodically expressed concern about, and that continued without significant interruption regardless of what anyone said officially. The dice rolls were accompanied by the ritual of the toast. To drink a health, to raise a bowl of punch in honor of some person, present or absent, living or dead, was the lubricating social ritual of the 17th century tavern. The person named could be a friend. It could be a successful raid. It could be the health of the pretender, James Francis Edward Stuart, the Catholic claimant to the English throne, whose cause several pirate crews toasted with particular enthusiasm, partly because they genuinely believed in it, and partly because it was technically treason, and toasting things that were technically treason was, in a tavern full of technically pirate privateers, a natural activity. One account from a captured merchant captain, William Snellgrave, describes being compelled to join a pirate crew's dinner and toast the pretender's health, with the clear understanding that declining was not a realistic option. He drank. He survived. He wrote about it afterwards with the precision of a man who had kept very careful mental notes throughout an experience he had not expected to survive. Jeremiah Coughlin, the pirate captain whose guest he briefly was, proceeded through a sequence of toasts: the health of King James III, the confusion of his enemies, the success of the current voyage, with the ceremony of a man conducting a formal dinner, which in its own way he was. The pirates of Port Royal were, if certain accounts are to be believed, also participants in the tavern evening. A Dutch explorer passing through the town in the late 17th century left a description, quoted and requoted in subsequent sources, to the effect that the pirates of Port Royal gathered to drink from the large stocks of ale with just as much enthusiasm as the human customers who frequented the taverns. Parrots are genuinely attracted to fermented fruit and will drink alcohol if it is available to them. This is a documented fact rather than a charming story. And Port Royal had both parrots and rum in abundance. The image of a Caribbean grey parrot perched on a Port Royal tavern counter, drinking from a bowl of ale with the dedicated focus of a regular customer, is not entirely outside the bounds of what Port Royal was. There was a howler monkey too at some point in this world. The story runs that the young Edward Teach, not yet Blackbeard, not yet the most theatrically effective pirate of the Golden Age, just a young man making his way in the Caribbean, encountered a howler monkey in a Port Royal tavern during his early years, named it Jefferson, and kept it for a period as a companion. Howler monkeys are large, striking animals, the loudest land animals in the Americas, capable of producing a call that carries 3 miles in open forest. What Jefferson's opinion of life at sea was, and what became of him eventually, the record does not say. The night deepened. The fiddle played. The punch bowls were refilled. The dice rattled, and the coins changed hands, and the toasts were made. And eventually, in the small hours of the morning, something approaching quiet descended. Not silence. Never silence in Port Royal, but a relative quiet. A slowing down, a gradual reduction in volume, as the men who were still awake became fewer and those who remained became quieter, subdued by rum and by the particular quality of the very late night that makes even the most determined reveller thoughtful. The sleeping arrangements in Port Royal were as varied as the town's population. Ship captains of any status had their cabins on their vessels and retreated there at whatever hour the evening's entertainments concluded. Successful pirates with money to spend rented rooms. The better taverns had upstairs accommodation, and the town had a sufficient supply of lodging houses to serve the hundreds of sailors who were in port at any given time. Men who had spent their money, or who had never had much to begin with, slept where they could. Sometimes in the lower decks of their ships, in hammocks that moved with the gentle rocking of a harbour anchorage, sometimes on the dock itself, or on the beach at the edge of the town, in the warm Caribbean air that at night became something close to comfortable, even in the months when the days were brutal. The hammock, incidentally, was a Caribbean invention, a Spanish word derived from the Taino people of the islands who had been sleeping in them long before the Europeans arrived, and who were, in the matter of tropical sleeping technology, centuries ahead of their visitors. When English sailors first encountered hammocks in the 16th century, they found them a revelation, a sleeping surface that moved with the ship rather than against it, that required no floor space, that could be slung between any two fixed points, that cradled its occupant in a way that was, once you had learned to get in without falling out, genuinely comfortable. The Royal Navy eventually adopted the hammock for all its sailors. The pirates, whose ships were not organized on naval lines but on the principles of the articles they had agreed to, used whatever was available. Hammocks where they were strung, sleeping mats on deck in fair weather, the hold of the ship where nothing else was on offer. In Port Royal, on a warm Caribbean night, with the trade winds moving through from the east and the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky above the harbour, sleeping on a ship at anchor was not the hardship it sounds like. The water rocked the hull in slow, small rhythms. The rigging moved and murmured in the wind. The sounds of the town reached the ships as something softened by distance and water. The fiddle, the occasional raised voice, the sound of feet on the dock. And then these too faded as the night progressed, and even Port Royal's considerable energy began very slowly to run thin. Part 5. The Earthquake, and what came after. On the morning of June the 7th, 1692, Port Royal ceased to exist. The earthquake that destroyed the town came at 20 minutes to noon. The exact time is known not from any clock tower or sundial, but from a pocket watch recovered during an underwater archaeological excavation of the harbour in 1959. Found in the ruins of the waterfront district where it had lain on the bottom for 267 years. Its hands stopped at precisely 1143. The earthquake was a series of 3 tremors in quick succession, the third and largest estimated at magnitude 7.5. They struck a town that had been built with the optimism of people focused on opportunity rather than geology, on unconsolidated sand at the end of a peninsula in one of the most seismically active regions of the Caribbean. The sand liquefied. Liquefaction is a geological process in which saturated sandy soil, subjected to intense vibration, briefly loses its structural properties and behaves like a dense liquid. It was not understood in 1692. It is well understood now. The combination of Port Royal's geography, a spit of sand on the edge of a harbour, the sand saturated with seawater at depth, and the violence of the earthquake created the conditions for liquefaction on a massive scale. Buildings that had been constructed on pilings driven into sand, the waterfront buildings, the wharves, the warehouses, found their pilings no longer in anything that could bear weight. The ground swallowed them. 2/3 of the town sank into the harbour within minutes. The wharves, which had been lined with fine brick buildings that contemporary observers compared to the streets of London's Cheapside, vanished under the water. 2 entire streets behind the waterfront followed. The sand opened and closed around people where they stood, as multiple eyewitness accounts describe in identical, horrified terms. The ground would open, swallow a person, and then close again, leaving them buried to the neck, or to the waist, or simply gone. Some who were swallowed were spat out elsewhere, ejected by the liquid sand onto adjacent streets or into the harbour itself. One of them survived to leave a gravestone that is remarkable even among the remarkable objects that the Pirate Age produced. Louis Goldie, a French Huguenot who had come to Jamaica to escape religious persecution in France, was swallowed by the earthquake, and then, as the account on his gravestone reads, by the providence of God, was by another shock thrown into the sea, and miraculously saved by swimming, until a boat took him up. He lived another 44 years. He was buried at Green Bay in Port Royal, and his gravestone records the earthquake, his swallowing, his miraculous ejection into the harbour, and his long subsequent life in a single paragraph of matter-of-fact Caribbean English that manages to convey both the wonder of his survival and the practical temperament of a man who had been through something extraordinary and had then got on with things. The Reverend Emmanuel Heath, the Anglican rector of St. Paul's Church, had been celebrating a communion service on the morning of the earthquake. He noted in his diary that it was a cloudless, hot, calm morning, the kind of morning that gave no warning of what was coming. He survived the collapse of his church and wrote about what followed in letters that were eventually published. He described running through streets where the houses on one side were falling and the houses on the other were still standing. He described reaching the waterfront and finding that the wharf had simply gone, that where there had been brick buildings, there was now water. He wrote, "I saw the earth open and swallow up a multitude of people, and the sea mounting in upon us over the fortification." The HMS Swan, a naval vessel that had been in the harbour for maintenance with its ballast removed, was lifted by the tsunami that followed the main shock and carried over the collapsing buildings of the waterfront, coming to rest on the rubble of what had been several streets, upright, its cannons dislodged, but its hull intact. More than 200 people who had survived the initial disaster found refuge on it, clinging to its deck and rigging while the aftershocks continued. Heath was eventually taken off by longboat to a ship called the Siam Merchant, where he spent the night unable to sleep as the aftershocks came every hour, making all the guns in the ship to jar and rattle. Even before the shaking had stopped, the looting began. The accounts of the immediate aftermath describe survivors breaking into warehouses and houses that were still standing. The dead were robbed. Rings were taken from fingers, and when the rings would not come off the fingers were cut off to remove them. 2,000 people died in the earthquake and tsunami. Another 3,000 died in the weeks that followed, from the aftershocks, from the collapse of buildings that had been weakened but not destroyed, from the disease that followed, the miasma, as the period called it, the vapors rising from the disturbed ground, which was the 17th century's best explanation for what modern medicine would identify as cholera and typhoid, and the various infections that follow the contamination of water supplies in a disaster. The survivors who had taken to ships in the harbour were still there 2 months later, afraid to come ashore because the aftershocks were still occurring, sometimes 2 or 3 in a single hour, accompanied by sounds that the minister described as like the ruffling wind or a hollow rumbling thunder with brimstone blasts. Port Royal was rebuilt because the harbour was too valuable to abandon. But it was never what it had been. Another fire in 1703. A hurricane in 1722. The capital of Jamaica moved to Spanish Town on more stable ground, and Port Royal diminished into a naval station and then into a small fishing village. The underwater ruins of the original town are still there, beneath the harbour where they fell in 1692, accessible to divers. The streets, the foundations of the taverns, the artifacts of daily life in the wickedest city on earth, preserved in the sediment of Kingston Harbour for 300 years. And the pirates, needing somewhere to go, went to Nassau. Part 6. Nassau, the Republic of Pirates. New Providence Island in the Bahamas is a flat strip of limestone and pine scrub roughly 11 miles wide and 28 miles long. It is not dramatic landscape. It does not announce itself. What it has is a harbour well sheltered from the open Atlantic, approaches shallow enough that large Royal Navy warships cannot navigate them without significant risk of grounding, and a position at the centre of the 3 main shipping channels of the Caribbean. The old Bahama Channel along Cuba's north coast, the Windward Passage between Cuba and Hispaniola, and the new Bahama Channel on Florida's east coast. From a working pirate's point of view, this geography was essentially perfect. You could reach the busiest sea lanes in the Atlantic world within hours of leaving Nassau's harbour. You could retreat to that same harbour with reasonable confidence that the ships sent to pursue you could not easily follow. And you could provision, refit, sell what you had taken, recruit new crew, repair your hull, settle your accounts, and begin the whole process again, all within a community that had organized itself to support exactly these activities and had no particular interest in the formalities of maritime law. The town of Nassau had been formally named in 1695, though settlement on New Providence dated back several decades earlier. By 1713, following the end of Queen Anne's War, 12 years of conflict between England, France, Spain, and the Netherlands that had kept thousands of privateers employed, and then, with the Treaty of Utrecht, abruptly put them out of work. Nassau had become the primary gathering point for what historians call the final phase of the Golden Age of Piracy. The men who arrived in Nassau after 1713 were not, in most cases, men who had chosen piracy as a career from the outset. They were former naval and merchant sailors who had served in a war and come home to find that peace had made their skills surplus to requirements. The Royal Navy paid off its crews. The privateering commissions that had given legal cover to attacking enemy shipping were cancelled. The prizes that had sustained men through years at sea were no longer available. What remained were men with navigational expertise and gunnery experience, and the particular set of practical skills that life at sea produces, and no legitimate employment for any of it. Benjamin Hornigold was perhaps the most significant figure in the Nassau of this period. He had been operating from the island since around 1713, was a capable and cautious captain by pirate standards. He was notable for refusing to attack English vessels, a professional scruple that his crew eventually overruled, and had helped establish the Flying Gang, the loose association of pirate captains who used Nassau as their home base. The Flying Gang was not a formal organization in any sense that a legal document could recognize. It was a community of interest, a shared understanding among men who had adjacent needs. The security of a defended harbor, the intelligence network that the taverns provided, the infrastructure of a place where ships could be careened and provisions acquired and accounts settled. Henry Jennings, Hornigold's sometime rival and eventual associate, had made a famous early statement of his career by attacking a Spanish salvage camp on the Florida coast in 1715. The Spanish were recovering treasure from a fleet of ships that had been wrecked by a hurricane, and Jennings simply sailed up to the camp and took the treasure they had already recovered, which was an act of such audacious simplicity that it was talked about in every Caribbean tavern for years. He brought the proceeds to Nassau and spent them there, contributing to a local economy that was, by the mid-1710s, sustained almost entirely by piracy. The taverns of Nassau in this period were, by most accounts, rougher than those of Port Royal. Port Royal had the infrastructure of a proper colonial city, a functioning legal system, merchants, a church, goldsmiths, the basic institutions of settled life. Nassau in the 1710s was something closer to a camp. The colonial governor appointed by the crown had fled the island. The fort that was supposed to defend the harbor had been allowed to fall into disrepair so thoroughly that it was no longer a functional military installation. What governance existed was the informal governance of the Flying Gang. The strongest captain carried the day, as one period observer wrote, and the strongest captain's authority lasted only as long as his crew's willingness to back him. The drinking was the same as everywhere in the pirate world. Rum punch in large communal bowls, bumbo for the regulars. Whatever wine or spirits had come off the last prize vessel for those who preferred something different. The food was difficult. The island did not produce enough local provisions to sustain several hundred pirates, in addition to its permanent population, and the supply ships that a properly functioning colonial town relied on were not reliably reaching Nassau. The solution was the solution that the pirates applied to most provisioning problems. On the night of December the 13th, 1716, Hornigold's crew stopped a vessel called the Lamb and took from it 3 barrels of pork, 1 of beef, 2 of peas, 3 of mackerel, 5 barrels of onions, and several dozen casks of oysters, leaving the Lamb's crew with approximately 40 biscuits and a very small quantity of meat to get themselves to Jamaica. The court records that preserved this detail did so because the Lamb's captain subsequently testified about it. Nassau ate 1 captured cargo at a time. Part 7. The Careening Beach. Between the taverns and the harbour, there was another institution of the pirate ports that had its own quality, its own particular atmosphere, its own contribution to the life of these places. The Careening Beach. Wooden ships accumulated problems, and the most serious of these in the Caribbean was the teredo worm, a marine bivalve related to the clam that bored into submerged timber with an appetite and an efficiency that could reduce a hull from sound wood to something porous and unreliable within a matter of months in warm water. The Caribbean was ideal teredo habitat. Warm, shallow, abundantly productive, the sea around these islands supported teredo populations that regarded every wooden hull as a resource to be exploited with methodical patience. The solution was to haul the ship onto a beach, tip her onto her side, and deal with the hull while it was exposed. This operation, careening, was the essential maintenance activity of the wooden ship era, as necessary and as regular as changing the oil in a modern engine. The worms were removed. The barnacles that had accumulated and were slowing the ship through the water were scraped away. Rotten planking, where it had been found, was replaced with sound timber. The whole exposed surface of the hull was then treated with tallow and sulfur in various combinations, or with a mixture of pitch and tar and whale oil, to discourage the worms and smooth the surface. The ship was then righted, refloated, and pronounced ready. This was several days' work minimum, and considerably longer for a larger vessel. During the careening, the ship lay on her side on the beach, entirely unable to sail, entirely unable to fight, dependent on the defences of the harbour and the presence of other ships for any protection against attack. This vulnerability was the reason that careening was done in safe enclosed harbours. And this is why every pirate haven was, by necessity, a place with the right geography for it. The shallow inner harbour at Nassau, the protected coves of Tortuga, Port Royal's commanding position over the approaches to Kingston Harbour. During the careening, the men who were not working on the hull were free, freer than they were at sea, where the ship's routine imposed a structure that the articles governed. Freer, arguably, than most men of their era anywhere in the world. They had time, They had their share of whatever the last voyage had produced, and they had access to whatever the port offered, which, in the Golden Age of Piracy, meant the taverns and the gaming houses and the beach itself. The careening beach had its own social life, quieter and more domestic than the taverns. Fires were built above the tide line. Fish were caught in the harbour and cooked over them. Whatever the ship's stores included was supplemented by whatever the local market could provide. Rum was present, always rum, because rum was always present. Men slept on the beach on warm nights, in hammocks slung between palm trees or simply on the sand, which in the Caribbean at this latitude maintained a temperature through the night that made sleeping on it, with a light cover or without, a genuine comfort rather than a hardship. On the careening beaches of Nassau and Tortuga, the night was wide and quiet. The town behind was present. The sounds of the taverns carried in still air, but at a distance that made them a backdrop rather than an intrusion. The ships in the harbour, those that were not being careened, moved in the small circular patterns of anchored vessels in a sheltered harbour, their riding lights reflecting in the water. The stars were everything they were in Rome, and more. The Caribbean sky was, if anything, cleaner than the Mediterranean, the air more transparent, the Milky Way more vivid. The Southern Cross climbing above the southern horizon at latitudes that no Englishman had ever seen it from before coming to these islands. The men sleeping on the careening beach under that sky were not, for the moment, pirates. They were sailors on a beach, resting between voyages, in the particular peace that follows a long time at sea and precedes another long time at sea. Whatever they had done before they lay down, and whatever they would do when they next set out, were beside the point. The beach was warm, the stars were enormous, the harbour was still. Part 8. Tortuga, the first haven. Before Port Royal and before Nassau, there was Tortuga. The island sits off the northwest coast of Hispaniola, the island that is now divided between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, a rocky, hilly place about 37 miles long and 6 miles wide, its silhouette from the sea suggestive enough of the curve of a turtle's back that the Spanish named it Tortuga when they first charted it. It was not large, it was not fertile. It had no particular natural advantage beyond the one that mattered, a sheltered harbour on its southern coast with deep enough water for the ships of the period and a narrow entrance that could be defended. This was sufficient. The buccaneers who established themselves on Tortuga in the 1630s were, in their origins, hunters and meat curers rather than sailors. They had come originally from Hispaniola, the larger island to the south, where they had lived in the forests and hunted the wild cattle and pigs that the Spanish had introduced decades earlier and then largely abandoned when they moved their main settlements to other islands. These hunters were a rough mixture of nationalities: French, English, Dutch, escaped indentured servants, escaped enslaved people, and various categories of men who were living outside the structures of colonial society, either by choice or by circumstance. Their name came from their cooking method. They built wooden frames called bouquins over low, slow fires of green wood and smoked the meat they had hunted on them, curing it over many hours in a way that produced a preserved protein that would last weeks in the Caribbean heat. Boucaner, the French verb, became boucanier, and then, as the English borrowed it and mangled it, buccaneer. These were the buccaneers, meat smokers and hunters who sold their product to passing ships, and who gradually, as the Spanish increased their attacks on them and they developed the defensive capability to attack back, became something else. By 1640, they were calling themselves the Brethren of the Coast. By 1645, Tortuga had a fort, Fort de Rocher, meaning the Rock Fort, mounting 24 guns to defend the harbour, built by a buccaneer leader named Jean Levasseur, who had worked as a military engineer before his career took the turn that brought him to the Caribbean. The fort was built on a rock promontory above the harbour entrance, positioned so that its guns could cover the approach channel from both sides. It was effective. Spanish attempts to take the island in the 1640s and 1650s failed against it. The Tortuga taverns were rougher than those of Port Royal. This was a frontier community in a way that Port Royal, with its colonial governor and its courts and its goldsmiths and its church, was not quite. The buildings were timber and thatch rather than brick. The population was overwhelmingly male, transient, and armed as a matter of daily routine. Every man who went ashore on Tortuga carried weapons because every man on Tortuga had made enemies of one kind or another and carried weapons accordingly. The great nationality mix of Tortuga's population created a tavern atmosphere of particular character. French and English and Dutch and Portuguese sat together, communicated in the pidgin languages that trading ports generate, drank the same rum from the same bowls, and disputed the same prizes with the casual multinationalism of men for whom the European national quarrels that had shaped their original societies were remote, abstract things that had little bearing on the practical question of who was useful to have on a ship and who was not. Tortuga's taverns were louder, perhaps, than those of Port Royal, more multilingual. The songs were in more languages. The fights, when they happened, had a creative variety of insult available to them. François l'Olonnais made Tortuga his home port in the 1660s and conducted raids from it that made him famous across the Caribbean, and that the historical record preserves in detail, that is, to the modern reader, genuinely difficult. He attacked Maracaibo and Gibraltar in Venezuela in 1666 with a fleet of 700 men, returning to Tortuga with 260,000 pieces of eight, a significant quantity of silver plate and jewels, and goods that filled 22 large vessels. He sat in the Tortuga taverns with that wealth and spent it in the way that successful buccaneers spent everything they made, which is to say, quickly and enthusiastically, and without the slightest apparent interest in the concept of saving. He did not live long. L'Olonnais died in the late 1660s, somewhere on the coast of what is now Panama, probably killed by the Kuna people of the region, possibly in a manner that the sources describe with a specificity that suggests they considered it a fitting end for a man of his particular career. He was probably not yet 40. This was the other truth of the pirate tavern that the romantic version tends to skip past. The men who filled the benches and raised the punch bowls were, in most cases, not old men. They were young men, or men in their prime at most. The sea was hard, disease was constant. The hazards of the life, storms, shoals, the violence of the work itself, and the growing effectiveness of the authorities who were trying to end that work, meant that the population of the pirate havens turned over with a regularity that the regular presence of new faces in the taverns and the regular absence of familiar ones made quietly, matter-of-factly apparent. The tavern was respite from all of this. The tavern was what you were going toward when you were at sea, and what sustained the idea that the sea was worth enduring. Part 9. The Pirate Code and the Democracy of the Quarterdeck. One of the things that surprises people when they study the Golden Age of Piracy in any depth is how organized it was. Not organized in the way that a naval fleet was organized, with its rigid hierarchy of rank, its courts martial, its articles of war imposed from above by the authority of the crown, organized from below by the people doing the work, in a set of agreements negotiated between men who had chosen to be there and who retained the right to unchoose it. Every pirate crew operated under articles, a written code of conduct agreed to by the crew before a voyage began and binding on every person who signed. The articles varied between crews and captains, but certain features were consistent. The division of any prize was specified in precise terms that left no room for interpretation. The captain's share larger than the others, but not extravagantly so. Typically 1/4 to 1/2 for the captain, compared to a common sailor's 1 share. The quartermaster's share. The shares of the ship's specialists, the carpenter, the surgeon, the navigator, the gunner, and the equal share of the ordinary members of the crew, the men who worked the lines and manned the guns and made the whole enterprise possible. The articles also specified compensation for injuries, a 17th century occupational health provision negotiated in advance, covering the specific risks of the specific work. The loss of a right arm, 600 pieces of 8, or 6 slaves as an alternative payment if cash was short. The left arm, 500 pieces of 8. A right leg, 500. A left leg, 400. An eye, 100. A finger, 100. These were fixed rates, agreed before the voyage, paid from the common fund before any division of profits. This was insurance, written into the employment contract, available to men who had no other kind. The captain was elected. He could be removed by a vote. His authority at sea, in the moment of action, in battle, in the immediate crisis of a storm or a pursuit, was absolute. The articles recognized this. The chaos of a sea fight required a single voice and instant compliance, and everyone who had survived a sea fight understood why. But outside those moments, the captain governed by consent in a way that a Royal Navy captain, whose authority descended directly from the Crown and whose crew had no mechanism for questioning it, did not. The articles were often sworn to in the tavern. This was where the crew assembled before a voyage. This was where the captain laid out the plan, the target, the route, the anticipated reward. and where the men decided whether they were in. The punch bowls that were present at every social occasion in the pirate world were also present at this one. A large bowl of rum punch was prepared. The pipes were lit. The articles were read aloud or read to those who could not read for themselves. And the men who agreed to their terms signed their names or made their marks. When Howell Davis needed to choose a captain for his first independent voyage, a council was called over a large bowl of punch, at which it was proposed to choose a commander. When a new captain was elected, the guns were fired in salute, 3 cheers were given, and the celebration ended with an invitation from the new captain to those he saw fit to dine with him, and a large bowl of punch ordered for every mess aboard the ship. The tavern was not just where the pirates rested, it was where they governed themselves, and the governance they practiced there, with its equal shares, its elected leaders, its compensation for injury, its formal written agreements, was, by the standards of the 17th century, remarkable. It was not democracy in any modern sense. It was a practical arrangement made by men who had experienced the alternatives, the arbitrary authority of naval captains who could have a sailor flogged for insufficient deference, the commercial exploitation of merchant shipping companies that paid wages barely sufficient for survival, and who had decided to try something different. Bartholomew Roberts, who may have been the most successful pirate of the Golden Age in terms of the number of prizes taken, estimates range upward of 400 ships in a career of less than 4 years, which works out to 1 prize every few days, had articles that were in several respects strikingly progressive. Equal shares for the crew, no gambling at cards or dice on board the ship, no women on board, every man to have a vote in the ship's affairs, musicians to have their liberty on the Sabbath to rest, but on the other 6 days to play for any man who requested it. And the provision that is perhaps the most charming in its revelation of what Roberts's crew had apparently found difficult about life at sea: no lights or candles after 8 in the evening. Those who wished to continue drinking after the official end of the evening were to do so on the open deck, in the dark, with whatever discretion the open deck in the Caribbean allowed. This was an attempt to impose on the ship the shape of a reasonable night, a night that ended at a sensible hour, that did not become the bottomless night-time of the Port Royal Tavern. It did not, one suspects, entirely succeed. But it is touching that Roberts's crew thought it worth writing into law. Part 10. Woody's Rogers and the End of Nassau. By 1717, the Republic of Pirates had made itself too conspicuous to leave alone. 600 pirates operating from Nassau, attacking ships of every nationality, no longer privateers with specific enemies, but freebooters making enemies of everyone. This had become a significant concern for the trading interests of every European power with Atlantic commerce. English merchants were losing ships. Spanish merchants were losing ships. The insurance rates on Caribbean cargo routes were rising in response to the sustained and effective disruption that Nassau's pirates were maintaining. The point at which piracy shifted from a tolerated nuisance to an existential threat to commerce had been reached. King George I responded with a royal proclamation in September 1717, offering a full pardon to any pirate who surrendered to the appropriate colonial authority before September of the following year. The pardon was genuine. No conditions beyond the surrender. No retrospective prosecution for anything that had happened before the acceptance date. A significant number of pirates took it. Benjamin Hornigold, who had helped build Nassau's reputation as a pirate haven, accepted the pardon and spent his remaining years hunting pirates on behalf of the crown. The symmetry of his career, having created the conditions for Golden Age piracy in Nassau and then working systematically to end it, is one of those ironies that the historical record occasionally delivers. The man sent to enforce the pardon and restore royal governance to Nassau was Woodes Rogers. Rogers was not a naval officer in the conventional sense, though he was one of the most experienced maritime figures in England at the time. Between 1708 and 1711, he had commanded a privateering expedition that circumnavigated the globe, attacking Spanish settlements in the Pacific, sailing across that ocean, returning home via the Cape of Good Hope. The expedition was not without difficulties, including a significant mutiny and the ongoing challenge of keeping a crew cooperative across 3 years of ocean. What had distinguished Rogers's command was a combination of firmness about essentials and practical flexibility about the rest. On the island of Mas a Tierra in the South Pacific, now called Isla Robinson Crusoe, Rogers's expedition had encountered, in February 1709, a man who had been living alone on the island for 4 years and 4 months. Alexander Selkirk, a Scottish sailor who had quarrelled with his captain on a privateering voyage and had been put ashore at his own request rather than continue on a ship he considered unseaworthy, had survived alone on the island by hunting feral goats and cats, by making fire with 2 sticks, by building 2 huts, and by reading the Bible so frequently that he had almost forgotten how to speak to other people when Rogers's ships arrived. Rogers took him aboard, gave him a new set of clothes, and eventually returned him to England, where his story reached the ears of a writer named Daniel Defoe, and became, with some elaboration, Robinson Crusoe. Rogers arrived at Nassau in July 1718 with 3 Royal Navy warships, a charter as Governor of the Bahamas, and a very clear sense of what he intended to do. He rebuilt the fort. He installed cannon at the harbour entrance. He printed pardons and distributed them to those who would accept them. And he hanged 8 pirates in the first weeks of his arrival, their bodies displayed on a prominent gallows where everyone entering the harbour could see them. The message was received. Blackbeard, Edward Teach, was killed in battle off the coast of North Carolina in November 1718, 5 months after Rogers arrived, in a fight that became famous partly because of how long it took to end. He had been shot multiple times, stabbed multiple times, and continued to fight until he could not. Charles Vane, who had fired on Rogers's ships when they entered Nassau Harbour and refused the pardon and escaped, was eventually captured and hanged at Port Royal in 1721. Calico Jack Rackham, whose crew included the celebrated women pirates Anne Bonny and Mary Read, was taken in 1720 and hanged at the same gallows point. The Republic of Pirates ended not with a single decisive moment, but with the gradual removal of the conditions that had made it possible. The taverns of Nassau continued to serve rum. The harbour continued to shelter ships. But the ships were merchant vessels and naval vessels now, and the men drinking in the taverns were traders and fishermen and colonial settlers, and the Golden Age was over. Part 11. The Tavern Keeper's View. We have been spending so much time with the pirates that we have neglected the person behind the counter. The tavern keeper of the pirate ports was not, in most cases, a pirate. She was a business person, and female tavern keepers were not uncommon in the colonial Caribbean, as they were not uncommon in English tavern culture more broadly. She operated in a specific and demanding commercial environment with a clientele that was both her best source of revenue and her most challenging management problem. The inventory was expensive. Rum had to be acquired from the distilleries of Barbados or Jamaica, or from whatever had come off the last prize vessel. Wine and spirits needed to be sourced from somewhere. The food required fresh ingredients that in a place like Nassau in the 1710s were not reliably available and had to be improvised around whatever the current circumstances offered. The building required maintenance, and the staff, enslaved workers in most cases in the colonial Caribbean, which is a reality that the romantic history of piracy consistently obscures, had to be managed and their labor sustained through the long hours that the tavern trade demanded. The tavern keeper's particular challenge was that her best customers were also her most problematic. A pirate crew returned from a successful voyage would spend money in quantities that could sustain the establishment for weeks. They would also, with significant probability, break the furniture in the process. They would start fights that damaged the property and injured or killed other customers. They would drink until they were incapable and require management of their incapacity. They would bring in goods for sale, the provenance of which the tavern keeper was officially required to question and practically unable to investigate too closely if she wished to remain in business. The extension of credit was a skill that the successful pirate tavern keeper developed carefully. The man who promised to settle his account on his return from the next voyage might not return from the next voyage. The mortality rate among active pirates was significant, and the causes of death were various. The tavern keeper who extended credit too freely would end the year with a ledger full of debts attached to men who were at the bottom of the Caribbean. She extended it carefully to men whose survival she had reason to believe in, and she kept her records with the precision of a merchant banker operating in a market where the collateral was a man's continued existence. She also knew everything. She knew which captains were planning what, because those plans were made at her tables. She knew who had money and who had spent it, because the spending happened in front of her. She knew the politics of the harbour, the alliances being formed and dissolved, the disputes between crews, the information about naval patrols and merchant shipping that the tavern gathered and redistributed. The knowledge was not something she went looking for. It came to her with the trade, as inevitable as the smell of rum, and she kept it in the same way she kept her accounts, carefully, usefully, and with a clear understanding of what it was worth and to whom. At the end of the night, when the last customer had finally gone and the bowls were empty and the dice were still and the fiddle player had taken himself home, the tavern keeper sat down in the quietest moment of her day and counted the money. It was, by the standards of the 17th century Caribbean, a reasonable living. It was also, for a woman operating in a world where her options were more constrained than the pirate's options in most respects, a genuine exercise of competence and authority. She was, in her own way, no less extraordinary than the men who sat on the other side of her counter. Part 12. The Harbour in the Small Hours. Nassau at the 3rd hour of the morning. The taverns have not closed. They rarely fully closed in the pirate years, but they have quietened. The men who were going to drink themselves to oblivion have done so in their chairs or on the floor or on the careening beach outside, with the philosophical acceptance of the Caribbean night air for whatever it receives. The men who are going to get into fights have resolved those fights one way or another. The fiddle player finished an hour ago and has gone home or gone to sleep somewhere close by, and the music that has been the evening's backbone is gone. Outside, the harbour is still. The ships at anchor shift in the small circular movements of vessels in a sheltered harbour at night. Not the purposeful, powerful motion of a ship at sea under sail, which is something that belongs to the body as much as to the ship, that you feel in your feet and your legs and your gut. This is different. This is the harbour's movement, small and circular and repetitive. The ship describing a slow arc around its anchor chain as the current and the gentle wind move through the harbour, never completing the arc, always returning, rocking slightly on the small waves that reach even this sheltered water. The riding lights on the anchored ships make small reflections in the harbour water, each one a column of light reaching down from the lamp at the ship's bow into the darkness of the water below. They move with the ship's movement. They do not go out. A man sitting on the dock at this hour, a man who has had enough rum to be past the stage of wanting more, who is awake but not urgently awake, who is watching the water and the riding lights and the stars above the harbour entrance, is having an experience that is genuinely hard to describe. Not happy exactly, or not only happy, not unhappy. Something more settled than either. The particular quality of a man who has been at sea for a long time and is, for the moment, on solid ground. The ship he arrived on is anchored 30 yards from the dock. It will need careening before it goes back to sea. The carpenter has been noting a section of the hull that he will want to deal with. The captain has not announced the next voyage. These are tomorrow's concerns, or the day after's, or the week after's. There is no particular urgency. Tonight, there is the harbour and the stars and the riding lights and the water. The stars above Nassau. The Milky Way cutting across from southeast to northwest in the particular way it arranges itself at this latitude, somewhat higher in the sky than it appears from England. The broad river of it clear and vast and absolutely indifferent to the small events of the harbour below. The Southern Cross, low in the south, is visible here. That cross of 4 bright stars that no Englishman ever saw from England, that is visible only from below about 25 degrees north latitude and that surprised and moved every sailor who saw it for the first time, because it was a proof that the sky changed as you moved across the world, that the universe did not look the same from every point within it. The trade wind comes from the east, warm and steady, smelling of salt and the open Atlantic beyond the harbour mouth. It moves the surface of the water in small, regular patterns. It moves the palm trees on the shore behind the town in the same small, regular patterns. It has been doing this since before anyone on the island was alive, and will continue doing it after everyone now on the island is dead. And it does not know that it is providing the pleasantest possible version of a Caribbean night. The man on the dock closes his eyes. He does not intend to sleep here. The hammock is on the ship, slung in its place below decks, moving with the ship's small movements. He will go back to it in a few minutes. He will settle himself into it, and the ship's rocking will do what it does, what it has always done for sailors at anchor in sheltered water, which is to complete the work that the rum began, slowly, gently, without announcement. But the dock is warm under him, the wind is warm on his face, the stars are far away and very numerous, and the harbour is very quiet, and there is nowhere he is urgently required to be. The dice rattle once from inside the tavern. 3 men who cannot stop, playing in the corner by lamplight. The lamp behind them flickers as the door opens and one more man leaves for the night, walking unsteadily in the direction of the dock, not quite walking a straight line, but walking approximately in the direction he intends. The door closes. The harbour is quiet. The ships rock very slightly on the small movements of the water. The stars continue their slow turn above the island, the Milky Way moving west as the night deepens, the Southern Cross rising slightly as the hours pass, the trade wind constant and warm and endlessly itself. And one by one, in their hammocks and their rented rooms and their corners of taverns and on the warm sand of the careening beach, the pirates of Nassau are sleeping. Part 13. What the Tavern Kept. The taverns of Port Royal and Tortuga and Nassau kept more than rum. They kept the idea that there was somewhere to go after the sea. They kept the possibility that the voyage would end and the proceeds would be divided and the articles would be honoured and you would sit down, finally, in a place that was not a ship and eat something that was not hardtack, and drink something that was not the water of a barrel that had been at sea too long, and be among other people, and be still. The Golden Age of Piracy was not a long period. Measured from the establishment of Port Royal as a pirate haven in the 1650s to the hanging of the last of the Nassau pirates in the early 1720s, it lasted perhaps 70 years. Measured from its most intense phase, the years between Tortuga's peak in the 1660s and Woodes Rogers's arrival in Nassau in 1718, rather less than that. The men who filled the taverns during those years were, for the most part, ordinary men who had ended up in extraordinary circumstances through a combination of economic pressure, individual choice, the particular accidents of being alive in a specific historical moment, and the fundamental human propensity for following the path of most excitement when the path of least resistance turns out to offer nothing worth having. The stories that were told in those taverns, the information that passed across those counters, the toasts that were drunk in those bowls of punch, most of them are gone, as the conversations of taverns generally are. What remains is partial and fragmentary and filtered through the records of people who were, in most cases, not actually in the taverns when the interesting things were said. But the harbour remains. Nassau Harbour is still there, still sheltered by its natural approach, still sitting at the centre of the Bahamian shipping lanes. The underwater ruins of Port Royal are still there beneath Kingston Harbour, the streets and foundations of the wickedest city on earth still roughly in their original positions, the objects of daily life still identifiable to the divers who visit them. The island of Tortuga is still there off the northwest coast of Haiti, rocky and quiet, and very different from what it was in the 1660s, but still the same island, the same harbour, the same position between Cuba and Hispaniola that made it useful. The taverns are gone. The men who sat in them are gone. The fiddles are silent, and the dice are still, and the punch bowls have been empty for 300 years. But something persists. The quality of a sheltered harbour at night. The trade wind warm from the east, the stars enormous overhead, the Southern Cross low in the south, the water moving gently under the ships that are anchored there, rocking them in the small circular rhythms of a sheltered anchorage, back and forth, in the particular language that still water speaks to things that float upon it. The language that says, "Rest now. The voyage is over for tonight. The sea will be there in the morning, as it has always been, waiting. Rest now." The harbour is quiet, and the night is warm, and there is nowhere you need to be